Who had the better career, the last Stylebender or the Nigerian Nightmare? And no, their careers aren't over, but let's see who is better so far. We're going to be weighing all their past opponents and seeing who had the more difficult run and the better career, so let's go. It took Usman 8 fights to get his first title shot, and it took Israel about 5. And comparing their pre-title run with Usman, he fought some iconic names. Of course, now champ Leon Edwards, who has gone on to defend his belt. Sean Strickland, who became middleweight champion and lost his belt, obviously, to Dricus in a really close fight. You might have thought he won. Damian Maia, who was definitely older at the time but still dangerous, and to this day still is one of the best submission experts in the UFC's entire history. And then another submission expert in RDA, who was a former champ and still a legend to this day. Comparing that to Izzy's run with his notable names, we have Vettori, who's still a title contender, not the greatest fighter in the world, but a gatekeeper of the top 5. Brad Tavares, he's still in the mix, and it has never really took that huge leap forward that everyone thought was going to happen after the Izzy fight, but he's still a good fighter. Derek Brunson, who really got old and lost some huge fights to Cannonier and Dricus, but he was in the mix for a while until moving to the PFL. And then of course Anderson Silva, who was older at the time but still a legend, still decent enough. He was never going to beat Izzy, especially if that fight was 5 rounds, but he was really doing his thing in that fight and had moments and created, of course, iconic fights. The youth of these fighters at the time needs to be taken into account. So of course Leon Edwards then is not the same as Leon Edwards now, but neither was Usman and Izzy. They were still coming into their own and still trying to figure out what their style was and how it fit into the UFC. So just because Vettori and Leon and Damian Maia were all at a different point in their career than their prime, I think you can still put a lot of value and weight into these fights, because it's not like they're completely irrelevant. It's not like they don't do anything for their future, but it is a modifier at the end of the day when you're looking at their total resumes. But you also have to take into account for Izzy compared to Usman what it was like coming into their fight. For Usman, he was coming in from being a heavy wrestler, fighting in smaller promotions, basically wrestling this whole time, wrestling through college, and then he did a stint at the Olympic Training Center. For Izzy, he was coming off 77 kickboxing wins and about 5 boxing wins, and I think he had a few MMA fights too, but he wasn't the most experienced MMA fighter compared to his entire kickboxing record, and I think that's why he got fast-tracked to the title with only 5 wins, but he was also winning really dominantly. Yes, the Vettori win was a split decision, but I don't think anyone actually thinks that fight was a split decision. He was dominating the likes of Derek Brunson. He knocked Derek Brunson down, I think, like 6 times. So just because he had a lot of hype, he really was backing it up, much like Conor. And another note for both of their runs is Izzy only had 1 5-round fight throughout his come up to the title, whereas Usman had 2 in Damian Maia and of course RDA. Essentially, the only way either of them was going to get that is if they were a fight night main event. I definitely think you have to weigh that in, because one, you could say it makes their first title shot a little bit easier, but the main point being that to have 2 5-round fights in your come up to the title is pretty impressive, to say the least. Most fighters only have 1, and some of them don't have any. Dricus never had a 5-round fight. For Usman to have 2, it's pretty impressive. You also have to note that of their entire run, so Izzy's 5 and Usman's 8, they both only had 2 finishes. So yes, they weren't finishing everyone, but you also have to note that definitely set up their cardio well, especially Usman. That's 2 5-round fights to go to the decision. So when he was going into that Tyron Woodley fight, he was definitely prepared. Overall, I would say Usman's run to the title was probably harder. Of course, there was more fights. It was 2 main events and 3 former or now champions, whereas the only former or now champion Izzy had was Anderson, who is of course older too. So let's get into the meat and potatoes with the title reign. Since then, Izzy has had 11 title fights, whereas Usman has only had 8. So let's go bar for bar and see who is better than who. So when they got the belt, you have Tyron Woodley and Kelvin Gastelum. Now, Kelvin Gastelum at the time was a solid fighter. Of course, now he's gone on to lose a lot, and Woodley went on to not win a round until he fought Jake Paul 3 years after fighting Usman. Now, I would say that Tyron Woodley even then was a better fight than Kelvin Gastelum, because Tyron Woodley then was a killer. He had the hands, he had the wrestling, he was looking pretty solid, and yes, we all know what happened after, but I think if you were to take a first fight, I think most people would rather Kelvin Gastelum than Tyron Woodley. Then you have their second fight, so Colby Covington and Robert Whittaker. This is probably the closest you're ever gonna get to just killer top of the division fighters. Robert Whittaker and Covington got compared to for so long because everyone was like, if it wasn't for Izzy and it wasn't for Usman, both of them would have went on to just be killers and dominate their divisions, like they're clear 1A, 1B of their respective weight classes. Colby at that time was a killer, but Rob was a champion. Rob had fought Yoel. I would give it to Rob overall because he was already an established champion, and yes, Colby was the interim champ, but Colby went went on to really struggle after this and only beat Masvidal since then. And not to take the future too much into account, Rob at that time got absolutely dominated by Izzy. Colby almost beat Usman in that fight. Then you get to Masvidal and Yoel. So this is really strange because Masvidal Usman won was on Fight Island, of course, and it was a really boring fight, and the fight sucked. Like, Usman just stomped his feet the whole time, and they were both taking the fight on short notice, and some people throw that both ways. That's why the fight wasn't good. And then Izzy Yoel is one of the worst main events of all time. So if you look on paper, Yoel is a much more dangerous opponent than Masvidal. That's even if you're taking the 2019 Masvidal into account. But here's the thing, I think I would still give it to Masvidal overall because Yoel got that title shot coming off 2 losses. So I do think you could say that Yoel was on a downward trend, and Yoel really did not do anything to try and win that fight. Masvidal at least tried and really couldn't do much. Can't believe I'm putting Masvidal over anyone in this situation, but overall, I would say Masvidal is the tougher opponent there. Then you get to Burns Costa. Gilbert Burns at that time was on a serious run of fights. If you remember, he sort of dropped Usman at the start of that fight, kinda. I'd say he dropped him. I don't know if technically it was. And Burns was on a good run and has gone on to be a really solid fighter from there. Not much at all. He's literally fought like twice since then, and the whole weight cutting issue where he can't cut weight, he can kind of cut weight, and he pulls out of all these fights. But Costa at that time was the eraser. Everyone thought that he was going to be the one to go and beat Izzy. He was undefeated. He was an absolute killer. He had beat Yoel at that time. He had beat Johnny Hendricks, which is a really funny fight. But at that time, Costa seemed to be Izzy's match. This fight was supposed to be so hype, and Izzy absolutely decimated him. So for that fight, I'll give it to Izzy because he absolutely crushed Costa. And Costa was supposed to be the next great Brazilian middleweight champion. And of course, Izzy shut that down like crazy. Then you get to Masvidal Jan. Of course, Izzy loses to Jan, and Jan was the champion. This is a weight class above. Izzy chose not to put on weight, and Jan kind of just sat on him for the entire fight. I think some of the scorecards were 49-46. I think it was a little bit closer than that, 48-47 to Jan. But Izzy himself knows he lost that fight. And then Masvidal 2, where Usman put a real stamp on it and knocked him out. So of course, Usman got the dub there because he actually won the fight. Masvidal had done nothing to really warrant another title shot. It's not like the first fight was close. Yes, he took it on short notice, but you don't even know if he would have earned that title shot to begin with, the first one, if he didn't take it on short notice. So without having the in-between there fight for Masvidal, it just didn't make sense. Everyone knew what was going to happen. Well, no one knew he was going to get knocked out, but everyone knew that Usman was going to win. And yes, Izzy did have the tougher fight in Jan and lost, but I think a lot of people thought Izzy was going to be a lot quicker than Jan, and it really wasn't the case. Maybe the smaller UFC Apex Octagon had something to do with it, maybe it didn't, but I feel like if Izzy had another chance in that fight, he would have been able to do a lot of things differently. Next, we get to Covington 2 and then Vettori. So obviously Covington 2 was a much harder fight. In Arena, I actually thought Covington won. I know that's a hot take. I thought it was at least a draw for Covington. And of course, Vettori, Izzy completely dominated him. He was emoting on him mid-fight. That fight was really strange to watch because at that time of me watching the UFC, I never seen a title fight where the challenger looked so helpless against a champion. Izzy just absolutely crushed him, but almost to a degree where he cruised and he didn't finish the fight, which I think a lot of people have problems with, that Izzy never really went for it at this stage in his title run, and I'm sure you know what I'm talking about. Covington Usman 2 was another classic. There was so much action there. Usman dropped him. Covington came on later into the fight. The whole is it a takedown, is it not a takedown thing, Covington hurting Usman. This is a legendary fight. I think UFC 268 in general was a legendary card with Chandler Gaethje, Rose Weili. There were so many iconic fights on that card in general, and of course Covington Usman 2 was way better than Vettori Izzy, and Covington was also the way harder fight. Next, we get to Edwards and then Rob 2. So Rob 2 has some controversy. Some people think Rob won. I think Izzy won. I think when you watch that fight, it's hard because at that stage in Izzy's career, it really looked like he wasn't trying that hard to win his fights. And I know that sounds like a wild statement, but at the same time, I think you know what I mean. That run of Vettori, Rob, and Cannonier was very, very strange. And then Edwards Usman was crazy. Leon going into that fight had 8 wins in a row. And I think a lot of people thought that Leon was going to pose a good challenge because then he takes Usman down in the first round and everyone was like, this is interesting. And then he proceeds to get dominated for the next 3.5 rounds until headshot dead happens. And I think a lot of people would say overall going into those two fights, Rob was the better fighter. Rob was coming off some dominant victories to get that rematch. But I think since then, we all know that Edwards is the better fighter overall. Leon, I think, has a really good chance against Shovkat. And I don't think anyone realized just how good Leon was. Everyone knew he was elite, but I don't think anyone knew he was that elite because of the whole Nate Diaz thing and the fact that a lot of new gen UFC fans, myself included, weren't too familiar with Leon, especially if you started watching like 2019, 2020, like I did. I think a lot of people weren't that familiar with Leon at all. To see him shock Usman like that, I think overall, now that we can look at it from a bird's eye point of view, we should have been able to know that Leon was a really elite fighter. So for that, I would probably give it to Usman just because of the absolute run Leon was on. Then we get to Edwards 2 and Cannonier. And of course, even though I'm doing these side by side, don't look too much into it. I'm just doing it as a way to frame it in your minds of what each number of defense was. So Leon 2, he basically dominated Usman. And I know a lot of people might take problem with that, but if you remember, Leon won that fight comfortably while losing a point. A lot of people forget that Leon lost a point in that fight and still won. Since then, Izzy, Cannonier, I don't think anyone gave him a shot in that fight, which was crazy at that time, but that is peak form Izzy. That is Izzy after dominating everyone. So I don't think anyone really put too much stake in Cannonier. Yes, he had that one-shot knockout power, but you're going up against an elite striker in Israel Adesanya. I don't think Izzy at any point was in danger in that fight. I don't think Izzy ever got hit clean in that fight. And once again, that whole narrative of Izzy has to go out and get these better fights was coming. And of course, that's the end of Usman's title reign there. And Izzy went out and got bigger and better fights. Izzy versus Alex 1 was crazy. So it's basically 3-1 going into the 5th, and Izzy is not doing the best at the start of the 5th round. He had the whole thing with his leg where he had to roll backwards, which was pretty cool, but he of course gets stopped. And I'm of the mind that it was an early stoppage, especially when you look at it slowed down. You can clearly see that Izzy is slipping punches, and when he slips downwards, that's when Mark Goddard stops the fight. But I am also of the mind that Izzy was probably about to eat a big fat knee or a big uppercut from Alex. So who knows what would have happened there. But I would have liked to see that rather than the fight stopping because Izzy is slipping punches. Like, yeah, he had the whole weird thing where he sort of fell to the ground. You've seen fights go on for way longer before that. And I think it's just a really inconsistent with Mark Goddard when he gives fighters chances or not. So Alex is probably almost as hard as anyone on Usman's entire run, but mainly just because of the style going into it. Of course, Alex is not the most well-rounded fighter, but I think everyone knew going into it that because he's a kickboxer and Izzy's a kickboxer, he was going to have a lot of success, and that's exactly what happened. Alex too. Alex is just getting better at the grappling, more comfortable in the octagon, and of course, Izzy knocked him out cold. That is probably one of Izzy's most impressive wins. But that was crazy because Alex was getting a lot of shots off and Izzy came back, had that dog in him and put him out cold. And then Izzy lost to Sean, which was just pure domination by Sean. Start to finish, Sean absolutely dominated Izzy. Izzy did not look like he belonged in that fight. Izzy did not look mentally there. And Sean seemed to figure out how to be the legendary kickboxer in Israel Adesanya by just boneheadedly going forward, which is crazy. So aggregate overall, I think it's hard to say that Izzy hasn't had a harder title reign than Usman, especially with the two Masvidal defenses. They put a damper on the whole Usman title reign in general. But to coincide with that, a lot of Izzy's wins aren't as dominant as Usman's wins. Like, yes, he has the Vittori and the Cannonier, but then there's the Yol and then there's the Rob 2. So there's definitely an argument to be had there. I don't think title defenses need to be clear. Just being straight up and honest, like if you look at Jon Jones, he has had so many close fights, and I think most UFC fans, you have about 3 years it takes you to stop bringing up close fights. No one talks about Dominic Reyes, Jon Jones anymore. No one talks about Thiago Santos, Jon Jones anymore. No one is going to be talking Rob Izzy 2 anymore. It's just not how it works. If you keep on winning, everyone is going to forget about the close fights. And that's unfortunately going to happen to Usman because he does go on to lose to Khamzat, of course. And some people think Usman won. I think it was a draw, but it was a really weird fight and it really needed 2 more rounds. But as time goes on, Usman is in danger of not winning another fight for a really long time, which is kind of scary to think about because Usman was so dominant, and then you're like, is he gonna fall down the path of Tyron Woodley too? It's kind of scary. I hope Usman gets the W, but you have to remember too, every single fight that all of these guys have is individual and it's different, and all of them have their own challenges going into it, so it's a lot harder to say what is what. It's harder to remember all the narratives, who was injured, what was the opponent looking like at this time, what was the perception of the opponent, was the opponent dominant, and so on. Looking at it holistically can be a bit unfair because you're not taking everything into account. Usman did have some dominant decisions, but so did Izzy, and both of their reigns were iconic, but I think both of their last losses hurt them from being top 5 all time. And I think you can throw Volk in that mix too. Of this current generation, and I don't think anyone would dispute this, Volk, Usman, and Izzy were the kings. And now we have Islam coming up, but I think a lot of people were thinking that one of those three is going to snatch that top 5 spot at number 5. If you don't know, the general consensus of who are the 5 best fighters of all time, you have Jon Jones, Anderson Silva, GSP, Mighty Mouse, and then like Amanda Nunes too. Generally, you're gonna have some mix of those fighters, and then some people will swap out Amanda Nunes, some people swap out Mighty Mouse, and some people throw in Khabib, some people throw in DC. It's hard to say. With those last 2 spots being somewhat ambiguous, I don't know why Amanda Nunes and Mighty Mouse are ambiguous, but I think a lot of people just forget about them when they're making their list. But I think a lot of people were willing to give one of those 3 a slot in that, and I think with all of their last losses, I don't know if they're gonna get that, and I think it's a shame, especially with Volk, because he lost a division up, but who knows what's going to happen with him and Illa. So overall, I think Izzy winning his belt back too is super iconic, and I think that's a huge staple in his legacy that he was able to get it back, and who knows, he might even get it back again. UFC 300 at the time of recording has not been announced. I feel like by the time I post it though, we will know what the main event is. Like I said, I don't know what it is right now. I'm guessing it's Izzy Pereira light heavyweight, but that may sound crazy, but literally who knows what that's gonna be. Like it just announced the fight. So overall, who is better? Who had the better career? I would go with Israel Adesanya, just because he had some legendary performances against super dangerous fights, and yes, he did fight some legends past their prime, but I think Usman's title reign in general hasn't aged the best with the Masvidal defenses, the Burns defenses, the Colby defenses, and I think over time people are going to forget how good some of those fighters were going into those fights. The 2 Masvidal defenses really do work against him. His come up to the title was overall stronger than Izzy's, but Izzy's title reign, fighting Rob, fighting Vittori, fighting Kinnear, fighting Costa. Yes, he lost to Jan, but then he lost to Alex and came back and knocked him out. Overall, I think this was really close. I think you could go either way with it. I can see the narrative on both sides, but for me, I'm going to go with Izzy because he had some dominant staple wins against top-ranked fighters, whereas most of Usman's staple wins came against Masvidal and Burns. So if you enjoyed this video, why don't you check out this one on Sean O'Malley being the bantamweight GOAT, and if you enjoyed this video, leave a like, subscribe, and don't forget, we're just getting started, we're going to stay consistent, and I will see you in the next video.